Colorado, 1889. Owen Marsh had followed the same band of wild horses for 6 weeks, north out of the San Luis Valley, along creeks that ran thin with the summer drought, because a Mustang that could still find water in a dry year was worth more than anything a rancher could pay him in wages. He did not knock on doors looking for work. He had never needed to. The horses decided where he went, and that week they had settled on a stretch of high grass along Cedar Creek, on land that belonged, by the look of the fresh-cut fence posts, to somebody who took the place seriously. He tied his horse at the gate of the farmhouse and walked up, because it was the decent thing to do before a man camped on somebody else's water. The woman who answered the door had dark hair pulled back plain and eyes that assessed him fully before she spoke, the way a person looks over a horse before deciding what it's worth. She was 29, maybe 30, in a faded blue dress with flower on the sleeve, and she held the door like she had already decided how long this conversation would take. "I'm not looking for work, ma'am," he said, hat in his hands. "There's a band of Mustangs been working this creek. I'd like to camp a night, see where they go." She didn't answer that. She looked him over instead, his boots, the state of his saddle, the horse standing loose-reined at her gate without being told to. "Any family waiting on you somewhere? A job you're due back at?" "No, ma'am. No job, no town neither." "How long you been riding like that?" "Nobody's? Nowheres?" "Since I was 17. He turned his hat over once. 10 years, near enough." Something in her settled then, the way a person settles on a decision turned over too many times already. "I know this is sudden," she said plainly, "the way you state a fact already proven. But I need a husband." Owen stood there a long moment, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It didn't come. "A husband," he said slowly. "We just met." "I know how it sounds." She didn't look away. "I've got 75 days to put a husband's name on a piece of paper, or I lose the water this land needs to live. You're the first man to ride up this road in 3 weeks who isn't already married, already scared of me, or already my cousin." She let that sit. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to sign, and to work this land while you do it." "That's not much of an explanation." "No," she said, "it isn't. But here's the arrangement, plain, so you can weigh it honest." She counted it off on her fingers, the way she likely counted cattle. "Stay through, and the paper holds past the ditch company's deadline, and you'll have a parcel of this land in your own name when it's done. Not the ranch, a corner of it, but yours outright. Or don't stay, ride off whenever the horses call you off, and instead you'll draw a 5th share of whatever this place earns every year for 5 years, wherever you are. Either way you're paid. The land, if you're the staying kind, the money, if you're not." She looked at him steady. "I don't know yet which kind you are. Neither do you, probably." He turned his hat over again, slower this time. "That's not a marriage. That's a contract with a preacher standing in it." "That's exactly what it is." She didn't apologize for it. He thought about it for the length of one long breath, then untied his horse from the gate instead of the post, the way a man does when he means to go. He got 3 steps down the road before he stopped, stood there a moment with his back to her, working something over. Then he turned around. "I'll hear the rest," he said, "but not the terms, the reason. A woman doesn't offer land to a stranger over a business arrangement unless there's something behind it she isn't saying. I want that part before I decide anything else." She looked at him a moment, and something in her face was almost respect. "Fair enough," she said. "Come in and eat. It's not a short story." Her name was Charlotte Vance. She fed him at the kitchen table that evening, and it was over the meal, once the light had gone soft and the day's urgency had drained out of her voice, that she told him the rest. Her father had died 8 months back. He had built the ranch from nothing And 30 years ago, when Charlotte was born, he and his brother had signed a water-sharing agreement with the Cedar Creek Ditch Company, the mutual outfit that governed the whole valley's irrigation. The agreement ran 30 years to the day, tied to Charlotte's own birth, and it required renewal by a recognized head of household. "Not state law," she said before he could ask. "Colorado's better than that. A woman can hold her own land here, her own deed, free and clear. This is only the Ditch Company's own rule, older than I am, written by the men who founded it. No woman's ever tested it, because no woman's ever had to." She turned her coffee cup a slow half circle on the table. "In 75 days, if there's no husband's name on that renewal, my cousin Emmett becomes the recognized signer instead. The land stays mine. The water goes to him. Out here, that's the same thing as losing it all." "Why him?" "Because he's the other name on the original agreement." His father and mine drew up the papers together. She looked up. "He's not a villain, Mr. Marsh. His own creeks run low 2 years running. He's got a wife and children going hungry, same as I'd be going hungry if this goes the other way. That's what makes it hard. He's not wrong to want it. I'm just not willing to be the one who loses." Owen sat with that a long moment, turning his cup the way she'd turned hers. Outside, the horses he'd followed for 6 weeks moved along the ridge in the last of the light, and he found, for once, that he wasn't thinking about which direction they'd run next. "I'll need a day," he said, "not to decide about you, to decide which half of your offer is me." She nodded, like that was the first sensible thing anyone had said to her in 8 months. He stayed. He worked the fence line with her the next day, said little, watched the way she talked to a green colt gone skittish in the heat, not raising her voice, not rushing it, just waiting, hand open, until the animal came to her on its own terms, instead of being made to. He watched her push through exhaustion without performing it for anyone. By evening, when she asked him plainly which way he'd decided, he didn't need the rest of the day he'd asked for. "The land," he said, "not the money. I've spent my whole life following other men's fences. I'd like, for once, to build one that's mine to keep." Charlotte studied him the way she'd studied him at the door, and this time when something in her face moved, it was closer to a smile than before. "Then we'll want it in writing," she said, "before either of us thinks better of it." She brought out paper and ink that evening and wrote the terms herself in a plain hand while he watched. The parcel, its bounds marked along the creek side of the north pasture, his name beside hers, the date. No lawyer, no witness, but the lamp between them. When she finished, she turned the page around for him to read, and he read it twice and signed it under her name without another word. "Then we'd best go to town," she said, folding the paper away, "and make the rest of it official." They were married on a Thursday, 11 minutes with the Reverend and 2 witnesses, and it was, by any honest measure, a business arrangement dressed in a clean shirt. Walking back to the wagon, Owen said, "I never thanked you." "For what?" "For asking me instead of someone else." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've been passing through places my whole life. Never had a reason to stop in one. This is the first time stopping felt like something I was choosing instead of something that happened to me because I ran out of horse." Charlotte didn't answer that, but she didn't look away from him either, and for 2 people who'd known each other 5 days, that was its own kind of vow. The work settled into a rhythm fast. Owen learned the cattle, the pasture rotation, the particular ache of Colorado summer ground. Charlotte taught him, on the second evening, the habit her father had drilled into her since she was 6 years old. Every night, before dark, you walked the pasture fence and counted the herd, horses and cattle both. "Don't rush the count," she said, standing at the gate with the evening settling gold around them. "My father used to say any fool can tell you how many head you've got. A good hand knows which one is missing. She nodded toward an old gray mare grazing near the barn, slower than the rest, always counted first because she was always the last to notice trouble coming. Start with her. If she's accounted for, the rest is easy. Owen counted with her that night, and every night after, and said nothing about how much the habit reminded him of an old discipline of his own, watching wind, watching sky, a habit built out of a fear he hadn't told her about yet. Emmett Vance came by in the second week, not with threats, but with the particular quiet of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like. He was 34, broad through the shoulders, with a look of someone who'd been comparing himself to a cousin his whole life, and losing. "Heard you found a husband fast," he said to Charlotte, though his eyes were on Owen. "I found a partner," she said. "The paperwork's a side effect." Emmett's jaw worked. "You know the creek that feeds your pasture and mine. It's run a third of what it should this year. There isn't enough for both operations to make it through August, not close to enough." He said it plainly, without cruelty, the way a man states a debt he can't pay. "I've got Sarah and 3 children on my side of that fence. I don't know another way to keep them fed." "Then we find another way together," Charlotte said. "Not this way." Emmett looked at the ground for a long moment, then rode off without answering. And Owen understood, watching him go, that this wasn't a man who wanted to be an enemy. It was a man who'd run out of other doors to knock on. 2 weeks later, Owen found it. The head gate on the upper ditch, quietly narrowed, a wedge of scrap wood driven in where no wedge belonged, cutting the Vance side's flow by nearly half. He'd spent enough years reading water to know exactly what he was looking at, and exactly whose hand had done it. He rode to Emmett's place and found him in the yard, and did not raise his voice, which somehow made it worse. "I know what's under your head gate," Owen said. "I'm not here to fight you over it tonight. I'm here to tell you I'll be pulling that wedge in the morning, and I'd rather you did it yourself, man to man, than have Charlotte find out I had to." Emmett's face went through several things before it settled on something like shame. "I didn't know another way," he said again, quieter this time. "Then we're going to have to find you one," Owen said, "before this dries up worse than the creek." Charlotte took the news hard when Owen told her that night, not because the wedge surprised her, but because it confirmed something she'd hoped wasn't true. She didn't forgive Emmett outright. She rode to his place herself the next morning and said little, and came home saying less. And it was clear to Owen that whatever had been between the 2 branches of that family before Charlotte's father died, it wasn't mended by a pulled wedge. There was friction of their own that same week, small, honest friction, the kind real partnerships have and business arrangements don't. Owen wanted 2 days to range after the Mustang band, still moving along the far ridge, a debt he felt to himself as much as to the horses. Charlotte wanted every hour he had before the 75 days ran out. "I'm not asking you to give up who you are," she said, standing at the fence in the last light. "I'm asking you to tell me before you go, not after." "That's fair," he said, and meant it, and didn't go. That same week, the old-timers in town started talking about the wind, a hot, dry Chinook blowing weeks earlier than it had any right to, and grass gone brittle enough to crack underfoot. Owen found himself watching the sky more than the fence line some evenings, a habit Charlotte noticed but didn't ask about. Not yet. It was on one of those evenings, going through a drawer of her father's old papers for the ditch company's original bylaws, that she found a letter, 2 years old, from a stranger, thanking a man named Owen Marsh for trying to save a child no one could have saved, and asking, gently, that he stop blaming himself for it. She didn't bring it to him that night. She sat with it a long while instead, and understood for the first time why he watched the wind the way he did. She asked him about it 2 nights later, the letter set between them on the kitchen table, not as an accusation, just an open door. Owen looked at it a long time before he spoke. 2 years ago, I was moving a band of horses through the Sangre de Cristo foothills when a grass fire came up faster than any fire's got a right to move, he said. I picked what I thought was the safest gap through the smoke. I was wrong about how fast it would close. There was a family traveling near us. A boy ran back in for a horse that mattered to him, and the gap I'd chosen wasn't there anymore by the time he needed it. He looked at his hands. I've never made a call like that again. Not once, in 2 years. I let other men decide, and I do the work instead. Charlotte didn't reach for him and didn't offer him comfort he hadn't asked for. She only said, "That's why you watch the wind." It's why I watch the wind, he agreed. The fire came 11 days later, on a night when the Chinook finally did what the old-timers had been warning it would, roaring down off the ridge into grass gone dry as paper. It started somewhere on the boundary land between the two ranches. No one would ever prove whose spark it was, and by then it didn't matter, and it moved toward the Vance barn faster than anything either of them had planned for. Charlotte ran the count in the dark, voice cracking through smoke, and came up short. One missing. The old gray mare, always first counted, always slowest. Gone from her place near the barn, cut off somewhere in the smoke between the corral and the creek. Owen stood still for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Charlotte watched the old fear take him exactly the way she'd feared it would. Watched him freeze at the exact moment a decision had to be made about which gap in the smoke was safe and which one wasn't. Then he moved. He chose a gap through the fire line he was almost certain would hold, based on where the wind was bending the flame, and he did not hesitate a second time. He drove the herd through it, Charlotte beside him on horseback, both of them screaming the animals forward through smoke that stung tears out of eyes already streaming. The gap held. Every horse that reached it came through. Emmett arrived with 3 of his own hands 20 minutes later, riding hard, carrying wet sacking and shovels, and threw himself into beating back the flame line along the north fence without being asked, without a word about water or wedges or 75 days. Whatever debt he owed, he was paying part of it that night in smoke and burned hands. They found the gray mare an hour before dawn, down in a gully off the creek, both hind legs burned past saving, her breath ragged and her eyes wide with a pain no bandage was going to touch. Charlotte knelt beside her first, one hand flat against the old mare's neck, and said nothing, because there was nothing honest left to say. Owen knelt beside her a moment later, rifle already in his hand. "I'll do it," he said, "if you'll let me." Charlotte looked at him, really looked, the way she had at the door on the first day, and understood what he was offering wasn't just mercy for the mare. It was a man choosing, on purpose, in the dark, the exact kind of decision he'd spent 2 years running from, and choosing it correctly this time. She nodded once and stepped back, and the shot that followed was clean and quick and echoed once off the burned hillside and was gone. Owen knelt there a moment longer than the task required, one hand still on the mare's neck, and when he stood, Charlotte put her hand on his shoulder and left it there, and that was all either of them needed to say about it that night. The Cedar Creek Ditch Company held its annual meeting 8 days later, ash still gray in the low places where the fire had burned closest to the barns. Charlotte and Owen brought what evidence the bylaws required. The ledgers Owen had kept in his own hand since the first week, neighbors willing to speak to what they'd seen, and, unexpectedly, Emmett, who stood before the 6 men of the board and said plainly that he'd watched Owen Marsh work that land like a man who intended to die on it, and that whatever the bylaws said about heads of household, he'd seen a real marriage with his own eyes on the night of the fire, and he wasn't going to stand there and pretend otherwise for the sake of 40 more acres of water. One board member, older than the rest, a man named Whitfield, who'd sat on the Ditch Company since its founding, was not so quick to move past the custom. "This rule's stood 30 years unchallenged," he said. "I'm not opposed to Mrs. Marsh on principle. I'd like her to answer a plain question, though, before I vote." He looked at Charlotte directly. "If your husband packed up tomorrow and rode on, the way men sometimes do, what then? What happens to this renewal, and to you?" The room went quiet. Charlotte didn't look at Owen for the answer, and Owen, watching her, understood that not looking was the whole point. "I'd still keep this ranch," she said. "I kept it 8 months on my own before he ever rode up my road, and I'd keep it 8 more if I had to. The difference now isn't that I need him to hold it for me. The difference is I know I don't have to hold it alone." She let that sit a moment. "That's not the same question you asked me, Mr. Whitfield, but it's the only honest answer I've got." Whitfield studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, and when the vote came it was 5 in favor, 1 abstaining, and the renewal was recorded in the company's book that same afternoon, under Charlotte's name and Owen's, side by side. That evening the two of them walked the pasture fence at the hour they always did, the ash smell still faint on the wind, the herd smaller by 1 gray mare and richer somehow for everything else that had been carried through the fire intact. Charlotte started the count from the gate the way her father had taught her, unhurried, watching for the ones that might be missing rather than rushing toward a number. Owen didn't say much. He rarely did on these walks, but he counted beside her, the way he had every evening since the 2nd week, and when they reached the end of the fence line and the tally came out whole, he took her hand without announcing it, the way a man takes hold of something he no longer has any intention of setting back down. Epilogue. A year later, the grass along Cedar Creek came in green, clear to the ridge, the kind of season that follows a hard one, the ground having been tested and having held. Emmett's fences ran alongside the Vance land now, under an arrangement the two families had worked out themselves, no board or bylaws required, and on Sundays his children rode over to chase the barn cats and eat too much of Charlotte's bread. The herd had grown past 60 head, counted every evening at the gate the way it always had been. On one of those evenings, with the light going gold, the way it had the day Owen first walked up that road, Charlotte started the count and came up 1 short. "We're missing 1, Owen said before she could say it herself. Charlotte turned, already half worried, already scanning the pasture, and then a small boy came barreling out from behind the barn, dust on his knees, laughing before he even reached them. "Right here!" he shouted. Charlotte looked at Owen. Owen looked back at her, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile and was better than one. She reached down and pulled their son up against her hip and turned back to the fence and finished the count.